It was a quiet morning when I found a dog sitting on my porch, looking lost and defeated. Little did I know his presence would unravel a heartbreaking truth that would change everything. The sun had just begun to rise on a calm and serene morning in our neighborhood. The crisp air of early spring filled my lungs as I stepped out onto the porch, ready to start my day. I had just moved into this quiet suburban home a few months earlier, looking for a fresh start away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The small house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac with tall, leafy trees that shaded the yard and a small garden where I often spent time tending to flowers. The neighborhood felt peaceful, like something out of a storybook, with friendly neighbors and children who played in the streets. My home had always been a sanctuary for me, somewhere I could breathe and feel at peace. But on that fateful morning, everything changed in a way I never could have expected. As I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, my eyes immediately landed on something. Or rather, someone who was sitting there. At first glance, it seemed like any ordinary stray dog. He was a medium-sized, scruffy mutt with a thick coat of brown fur and soulful eyes that looked both tired and hopeful at the same time. His body was slightly hunched, as though he had been out in the world for far too long. The scrapes on his paws and the weariness in his posture told me that he hadn't had an easy time. He didn't bark, nor did he rush toward me. Instead, he sat on the porch, staring at me with an almost pleading expression, as if waiting for something. It was an unusual sight. Stray dogs weren't exactly a common occurrence in our neighborhood, but there was something about his presence that immediately captured my attention. I paused for a moment, unsure of what to do. Was he lost? Or perhaps just looking for food? The last thing I wanted was to start a problem with a dog that didn't belong to anyone, especially considering how quiet the neighborhood was. However, something about the dog's calm demeanor made me feel that he wasn't a threat. He didn't seem like a dog on the attack or one with a dangerous disposition. He just seemed lonely. I crouched down, extending my hand toward him, trying to gauge his reaction. Slowly, the dog inched closer, sniffing my fingers before gently licking them. His fur was matted and rough, but there was a warmth in his touch that immediately made me feel an odd connection. At that moment, I made a quick decision. I would feed him. I turned back into the house and grabbed some scraps I had left over from the previous night's dinner, just in case he needed something to eat. The dog hungrily devoured the food I gave him, but he didn't leave. He didn't seem interested in running off or finding a new place to sleep. Instead, he stayed there, staring up at me with those soulful eyes. His gaze held a certain quiet sadness that seemed to pierce through me. He seemed to know something I couldn't yet understand. I went back inside, figuring he would eventually wander off. But as the day wore on, I realized that he was still there, sitting on my porch, almost as if waiting for me to come back outside. The dog had settled in by the door, curling up on the welcome mat, and there he stayed as if guarding it. It was strange, unsettling even, but there was something so deeply sincere in his eyes that I couldn't bring myself to shoo him away. For hours, I observed him from the window. He never moved, never wandered off in search of other food or shelter. He remained perched on a porch, patiently watching for any sign of life, as if hoping for something to change. As evening approached, I finally decided to approach him again. The sun was setting, casting an amber glow across the yard, and I felt an overwhelming urge to figure out why this dog had decided to come to my home. Something inside me stirred as I realized how deep the connection between us was beginning to feel. I walked out onto the porch and sat down next to the dog, carefully reaching out to pet him. To my surprise, he didn't shy away or react aggressively. Instead, he seemed to welcome the touch, leaning into my hand as if he had been waiting for someone to show him affection. I scratched behind his ears, marveling at how calm he was. I knew right then that this wasn't just a random encounter. There was something special about this dog, something that made him different from the usual strays I'd seen in the area. He was waiting for something, or maybe someone, and I couldn't help but feel that I was that someone. The dog didn't bark or show much excitement, but his presence was comforting. It was almost as if he knew he had found a safe place. I didn't know if he was lost, abandoned, or just trying to find some kindness in a world that had clearly been hard on him. What I did know was that I couldn't leave him outside to fend for himself. I didn't know it yet, but this moment was the beginning of something far deeper than I could have ever imagined. This dog's story was just starting. It would soon reveal itself to be far more complicated than I had thought. The dog, whom I later named Max, would become more than just a stray. He would become an inseparable part of my life, one that would bring not just joy and companionship, but a lesson about unconditional love, loyalty, and the unexpected ways in which life changes. As days passed, the dog, whom I had named Max, continued to occupy my porch. At first, I was hesitant to get too involved. After all, it's easy to believe that strays are just looking for food, attention, or shelter, temporary needs that can be easily provided. But Max wasn't like the usual stray. He didn't seem to be in a hurry to find food or shelter elsewhere. He didn't bark at other animals or try to play with the children passing by. He simply stayed, patiently sitting or lying on the welcome mat, his eyes fixed on the door, as if waiting for me. I began to wonder why Max had chosen my home. Strays, I knew, often roamed the streets looking for food or company, but he had picked my porch, of all places. And not just for a few hours, but every day, rain or shine. It was as though he had claimed the space as his own, and I had become his constant observer. What was his story? What had happened to him before he appeared on my doorstep? I couldn't stop thinking about it, and with each passing day, I became more curious about his past. Had he been abandoned by his previous owners? Was he lost? Or was there something deeper, something more urgent at play? Max seemed quiet and resigned, but there was a silent urgency in his gaze. It was as though he was trying to communicate something to me, something I couldn't yet comprehend. One evening, I decided to take Max to the vet to ensure he was healthy and didn't carry any illnesses that might affect me or other animals. I could tell from the state of his fur and the way his body was hunched that he hadn't had an easy time. When we arrived at the vet's office, Max was incredibly calm, almost too calm for a dog that had spent so much time on the streets. His reaction to being in an unfamiliar place was strikingly passive. He simply sat next to me, observing the surroundings without the usual nervousness or excitement that comes with such experiences. The vet, a kind middle-aged woman named Dr. Watkins, took one look at Max and raised an eyebrow. She motioned for me to follow her as she led Max into the examination room. After conducting a thorough exam, Dr. Watkins returned with some concerning news. Max, she told me, was malnourished, but that was to be expected for a stray dog. What really shocked me was his overall condition. Max had a few scars on his body, deep enough to suggest that they weren't just from rough play or accidents. They looked like they were the result of violence, perhaps inflicted by humans or other animals. The most striking discovery, however, was the scar on Max's chest, just beneath his fur. Dr. Watkins hesitated as she looked at it, and I could see her concern. It was an old scar, but it had healed poorly, suggesting that Max had been neglected for a long time. That scar, Dr. Watkins said softly, her tone heavy with emotion, is from something more than just an accident. It's the type of wound you'd expect from an attack, perhaps even something done intentionally. Her words hit me like a punch in the stomach. The thought that Max might have been hurt on purpose, that he might have been the victim of cruelty or abuse, sent a wave of sadness and anger coursing through me. I'd already suspected that Max was more than just a stray looking for food. There was something deeper beneath the surface, a story that wasn't being told, something Max couldn't communicate. Max had been abandoned, yes, but that wasn't all. The evidence suggested that he had been mistreated, neglected, abused, or left to fend for himself in the most unforgiving circumstances. But why? What had he done to deserve this kind of treatment? How could anyone look at his soulful eyes and see a reason to hurt him? As I processed this new information, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility toward Max. I had taken him in, offered him food, and given him a safe place to rest. But now, knowing the truth about his past, I knew that I had to do more. I had to help him heal, physically and emotionally. Max's response to the news was unexpected. He didn't bark or whimper, nor did he seem to react to the idea of being in a vet's office at all. Instead, he leaned into me, his body gently pressing against my side, as though he was seeking comfort. That small act of trust, allowing me to be his source of safety, was both heartwarming and heartbreaking at the same time. He was still so damaged, so vulnerable, but he had chosen to place his trust in me, and I couldn't help but feel a profound connection to him at that moment. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. I began to spend more time with Max, ensuring that he had plenty of food, water, and most importantly, love. I noticed small changes in him. He started wagging his tail when I returned home, and he began following me around the yard, as though he wanted to be by my side at all times. He was still reserved, still quiet, but there was a shift, a glimmer of hope, like he was starting to believe that not all humans would hurt him. But there was still something troubling me. Despite his growing attachment to me, Max refused to leave the porch. Every time I opened the door, he would immediately move to sit in front of it, watching me with those same intense eyes. It was as if he couldn't leave, as though he was waiting for something else to happen. I began to think that perhaps Max wasn't just waiting for food or affection. Maybe he was waiting for something more significant. He had shown me that he was willing to trust again, but there was still a sense of fear in him. Fear that he could be abandoned once more. Fear that no matter how much he tried to belong, he would always be left behind. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Max had become a reflection of something deeper, something in my own life. I'd also experienced abandonment and loss, even if it had been in different ways. Maybe Max's need for companionship wasn't just about survival. Maybe, just like me, he was searching for something that had been missing from his life for far too long: unconditional love. As I stood in my living room, watching Max from the window, I knew one thing for sure. This story wasn't just about a dog who had refused to leave my porch. It was about a bond, a connection that neither of us could explain. And the journey ahead would be one filled with healing, compassion, and ever-deepening trust that neither of us had expected. Max had become more than just a stray. He was now a part of my life in ways I couldn't have anticipated. His presence on my porch, in my home, had become a silent yet constant reminder of the profound need for trust and healing. But as the weeks went on, I found myself wondering whether Max was truly healing, or if there were still unresolved wounds that even I couldn't see. There was something deeper, an undercurrent of unease that lingered in his every movement. One afternoon, after several days of watching Max become more attached to me, I took him for a walk to the park, hoping that some exercise might bring him joy. Max had shown a spark of happiness in recent days, wagging his tail, eagerly following me around the yard, and even nuzzling against me for affection. But today was different. He seemed distracted, nervous even. The once peaceful stroll felt more tense as Max kept looking around, his ears alert, his eyes scanning the surroundings. I tried to reassure him, speaking softly and patting his head, but his anxiety was palpable. He had always been a cautious dog, but today, it was as if something had triggered his nerves, and I couldn't figure out why. He pulled on the leash, tugging me toward a side street I hadn't intended to visit. The path he was leading me down felt unfamiliar, lined with overgrown shrubs and scattered debris. I hesitated for a moment, but the leash tightened in my hand as Max led me onward. It wasn't long before we arrived at an old, dilapidated house that seemed abandoned. The windows were boarded up, the front yard overrun with weeds, and the paint on the house was peeling, revealing the harsh marks of years of neglect. Max stood in front of the house, his body rigid, his fur bristling as he sniffed the air. I felt a strange sense of unease creeping up my spine. Then it happened. Max suddenly broke free from my grasp, pulling the leash from my hand and darting toward the house. I called out his name, but he was already gone, running up the steps and through the cracked gate, disappearing into the darkened shadows of the front porch. Panic surged through me as I sprinted after him, calling out desperately. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the entrance of the house, but the door was already ajar. Max had vanished inside. I took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The stale air inside felt suffocating, as though it had been locked away for years. The house creaked with every step I took, the wooden floorboards groaning under my weight. The silence was overwhelming, but there was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. And then I saw it. Max was standing in the middle of the living room, his tail stiff and his posture tense. His gaze was locked on something, and as I approached, I saw what had captured his attention, a faded photograph pinned to the wall. The image was old, fraying at the edges, and the faces in it were barely distinguishable. But one thing was clear: Max's eyes were fixed on the photo of a family, standing together in front of a house that seemed eerily familiar. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what had been happening all along. This was the house. This was where Max had lived. He hadn't wandered to a random street or a random house. He had come back to his past. The photo was a clue to his history, a link to a life that Max had been forcibly torn away from. The realization hit me like a wave. Max hadn't been abandoned just anywhere. He had been left here, in this very house. The thought of it made my chest tighten. He had returned, not just out of habit or memory, but because this place, this house, was where his trauma had begun. And yet, he had never truly left it behind. All this time, he had been waiting for the truth to come to light, waiting for me to help him make sense of his past. I knelt beside Max, who was now trembling, his head low and his ears flat against his skull. It was as if he had never truly left this place, like every step had been a reminder of the pain he had endured here. I stroked his fur gently, my heart aching for him, but also understanding the depth of his trauma. He had never been allowed to heal. He had never been given the opportunity to move on. Max looked at me then, his eyes filled with an indescribable sadness. It was as though, in that moment, he was asking for my forgiveness, asking me to help him find the courage to leave this place behind, to finally move on and experience the love and safety he deserved. His entire being seemed to tremble under the weight of his past, yet he still stood there, waiting for me to do what no one else had been able to do: help him heal. I stood up, my heart heavy with a mix of sorrow and determination. This wasn't just about me taking Max in or offering him food and shelter. It was about something far more profound, a commitment to help him overcome the darkness of his past. I had unknowingly become the person Max had been waiting for. He had shown me his heart, his fears, and his hope for a better life. And now it was my turn to show him that the past didn't define him, that his future was still unwritten. I pulled Max close, wrapping my arms around him as he collapsed against me, finally allowing himself to let go of the tension that had gripped him for so long. In that moment, I knew what needed to be done. We would leave this house together. We would start fresh, leaving the past behind, and Max would find peace he had been denied for so long. Max's body relaxed, and I could feel the weight of his fears lifting as I whispered words of comfort to him. We would face this together, and with time, we would heal. It wasn't going to be easy, but I would be there every step of the way, offering him the love and patience he deserved. We left the house that day, and as we walked back to my porch, I noticed something different about Max. His steps were lighter, his tail wagging for the first time in what felt like forever. And though we both carried the scars of the past, we were no longer bound by them. Together, we would rewrite our story, a story of redemption, healing, and love. Max and I walked back to the house in silence, the air between us filled with a mixture of understanding and quiet resolution. The oppressive weight of the abandoned house's memories seemed to linger, but as we stepped onto my porch, it was clear that something had shifted. Max had been with me long enough to understand that this was his new home now, a safe place, free from the shadows of the past. Yet the look in his eyes still held remnants of the emotional scars he carried, scars I'd only just begun to understand. That evening, I sat on a porch, the gentle hum of life surrounding me. The rustling leaves, the distant chatter of neighbors, and the low hum of traffic created a rhythm to the world outside. Max, however, was unusually still beside me, his eyes staring out into the darkening sky. The shadows in his eyes had not completely lifted. He hadn't entirely let go of the past, and though he had made progress, I knew that true healing would take time. As I petted him softly, I thought back to the house we'd left behind. The haunting image of that old photograph pinned to the wall seemed to follow me, lingering in my mind. Max hadn't just run away from that place. He had returned there for a reason. The memory of the family in the photo struck me, and I wondered what had happened to them. Had they abandoned him, or worse, had something more tragic happened there? Was Max's loyalty to the family who had once cared for him a source of hope? Or was it something more complicated, a painful tether to the past? In the days that followed, Max's behavior continued to fluctuate. There were moments when he seemed completely at ease, wagging his tail, following me around the yard, even allowing himself to rest his head on my lap while I sat on the couch. Those were the moments when I felt the connection between us solidify, and I could see that he was starting to feel more comfortable in his new life. But then there were the quiet moments, the ones when Max would suddenly freeze, his body tense, his eyes darting to the door or window as if expecting something or someone. I couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency to uncover the full truth about Max's past. The image of the family in that photo had planted a seed in my mind. I needed to know more, not just for my peace of mind, but for Max's. I couldn't let this mystery hang over him, couldn't allow him to carry the weight of unanswered questions. As much as he had started to trust me, I knew that in order for him to heal fully, he needed closure. It was a late afternoon when I decided to go back to the house, the one that had so firmly anchored Max's memories. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find, maybe answers, or perhaps just the sense of peace that Max had been looking for. But as I arrived at the front steps once again, I felt a different kind of resolve. This time, it wasn't about uncovering pain or resurrecting old wounds. It was about offering Max the chance to release the past and move forward. The house stood silently before me, like a faded photograph locked in time, but this time I was prepared to face whatever lay within. Inside, the musty smell greeted me again, but I wasn't afraid. I wasn't here to revisit the trauma. It was about helping Max let go. I explored the rooms once more, moving through the hallways and looking for any clue that could provide answers. The walls seemed to echo with silence, but then I noticed something different, something I hadn't seen before. In a corner of the room where the photograph had once hung, I found an old box tucked away behind a bookshelf. I crouched down and carefully pulled it out, the dust settling around me like a soft veil. Inside, I found scraps of paper, old letters, and more photographs, this time of Max with a family I had seen in the picture. The letters, though yellowed with age, were filled with an emotion I had not expected: love, care, and concern. The family had clearly loved Max, and there was no doubt in my mind that they had meant to keep him. But time had changed everything. The letters spoke of hardships, moving to a new city, financial struggles, and the gradual breakdown of their household. The family, it seemed, had been forced to make painful decisions, one of which was parting with Max, the dog who had once been their loyal companion. The letters explained that they had no choice but to leave him behind, unable to care for him due to circumstances far beyond their control. But they had hoped, with all their hearts, that someone would find him, someone who could give him the life he deserved. The truth hit me like a wave. Max had never been abandoned in the way I had imagined. He hadn't been thrown away or left to fend for himself. He had been loved, but through no fault of his own, his world had collapsed. The family had done what they could, but in the end, they couldn't keep him. They had left him behind in the hopes that he would find a new family, one that could give him the life they couldn't. I sat there on the dusty floor, surrounded by the remnants of a past I hadn't known. And as I sat with the weight of the letters in my hands, I felt a deep sense of sadness for Max, but also a sense of relief. The mystery was no longer a shadow hanging over us. Max's past was revealed, and while it was heartbreaking, it was a truth we could now move forward from. He hadn't been abandoned. He had been left behind with love in someone's heart, and now he had found a new chance at life. When I returned home that evening, Max was waiting for me on the porch. He looked up at me with those soulful eyes, and for the first time in a long while, I saw a flicker of something different in them. A softening, a relief. He had been carrying the weight of his past for so long, but now we could both finally take a breath. That night, as I curled up next to Max on the couch, I whispered to him, "It's okay now. You don't have to carry it anymore. You're home." And as I felt his body relax next to mine, I knew that we both had come to terms with the past, that we were both ready to move forward. We were in this together, and whatever came next, we would face it as a family, Max, me, and the love that had brought us together in the first place. As time passed, the uneasy calm that had settled over Max and me started to crack. We had both hoped that the truth about his past, his former family's heartfelt letters, and the abandonment that wasn't truly abandonment would be enough to release him from the invisible chains he carried. But it seemed the shadows of his past were deeper than I had imagined. The healing process had barely begun before the conflict began to resurface, creeping into our daily life like an unwelcome guest. At first, it was subtle. A flicker of unease in Max's eyes, a soft whimper in the night. I thought little of it, dismissing it as an ordinary moment of discomfort, perhaps due to an unsettled dream or a minor anxiety. But as the days wore on, I started to notice a pattern. Max would freeze mid-step, his ears perked up, his body tense. He would stare intently at the windows, his tail stiff and unyielding, as if waiting for something or someone to appear. There were days when he would refuse to go outside, his body rigid with fear, his eyes darting back to the door, as though something invisible loomed just outside. It was on one of these days, as I tried to coax Max out of his shell, that the resurgence of conflict truly hit me. I stood by the front door, calling Max to join me for our usual walk. He had been more withdrawn recently, but I thought a change of scenery might help. "Come on, buddy, let's go outside," I said, my voice soothing, trying to coax him out of his hiding place behind the couch. But Max just stood there, his eyes locked onto the door. His ears flattened against his head, his tail lowered, and his breathing became shallow and quick. His fear was palpable, almost suffocating. "It's okay, Max," I repeated, trying to sound confident, though I could feel the anxiety creeping into my own chest. But Max wouldn't budge. After what felt like an eternity, Max finally looked at me, his eyes full of distress, as if trying to communicate something I couldn't understand. He whimpered softly, his body shaking with a deep-rooted tension. He was trying to tell me something that was buried deep within him, but I couldn't piece it together. Something had triggered this fear, this dread that clung to him like a second skin. I could no longer deny that the events surrounding Max's past had left deeper scars than I had anticipated. The letters from his former family hadn't been enough to heal him, and the peaceful days we had spent together had been fleeting. The truth, though it offered a semblance of closure, wasn't the magic cure I had hoped for. Instead, it seemed to have exposed a deep well of unresolved emotions in Max, a deep well that had been left untouched, hidden under the surface of his seemingly calm demeanor. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard, Max's behavior grew more erratic. He refused to go outside, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his body tense, rigid, as if someone was watching him. I sat on the porch, unsure of what to do. I couldn't help but feel helpless. The once joyful dog who had eagerly followed me through the yard, tail wagging, was now a nervous, broken creature, trapped in his own mind. I decided to take a more active approach. I had to get to the root of this fear. Max's unease couldn't simply be chalked up to his past abandonment. There was something more to it, something I wasn't seeing. I began to retrace my steps. The day I found the letters, the day I uncovered the truth about Max's past, had been a turning point for us. But I hadn't gone far enough. The house we had left behind, the one he refused to forget, was not the end of the story. There was more. I had to know what had happened after Max had been abandoned. What had occurred in those quiet, lonely months before he found his way to my porch. What had triggered this resurgence of fear in him? With a heavy heart, I made the decision to investigate further. I couldn't just let Max suffer in silence, his past haunting him from every corner of our home. I had to know what had happened to him in those final days before he had wandered onto my porch, refusing to leave. I returned to the old house once more. This time, the air around it felt colder, heavier, as if the walls themselves were guarding a secret. I walked around the property, retracing my steps once again. There was a sense of foreboding that hung in the air, but I pressed on, determined to uncover whatever it was that Max had been hiding from me. As I approached the backyard, I felt a chill run down my spine, and then I saw it. Buried under a pile of broken wood, hidden in the overgrown grass, I found something that I wasn't prepared for: Max's old collar. It was worn, frayed at the edges, with a name tag that had almost faded entirely, but was unmistakable. Max's collar. My heart pounded as I knelt down to examine it. This was the final piece of the puzzle I had been searching for. The house hadn't been abandoned because of hardship or necessity. It had been abandoned because of something far darker. The truth slowly began to sink in. Max's fear was not just a response to being left behind. It was a reaction to something far more traumatic. I began to understand the depth of the emotional scars Max had been carrying. The family who had once cared for him had vanished, leaving him to fend for himself. But in the months that followed, it wasn't just the absence of his family that had affected him. Something had happened here, in this very house, that had left Max terrified, scarred by a series of events that he couldn't forget, no matter how hard he tried. I returned to the porch that night, Max still nestled on the floor, his eyes watching me, waiting. I sat down beside him, gently stroking his fur. He didn't flinch this time. His body wasn't as tense. I knew he was still scared, still holding on to the memories that had been buried deep inside him for so long. But now I understood the source of his fear. The resurgence of conflict, his terror of the past, was not something that could be easily dismissed. It wasn't just a lingering memory. It was an ongoing battle, a war inside his mind that he couldn't escape from. As I sat there with Max, I realized that the real work was just beginning. Healing wouldn't come easily. It would take time, patience, and understanding. But I had promised Max that he was home now, that he was safe. And that promise, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, was one I intended to keep. The days that followed the discovery of Max's collar and the painful memories it resurrected were difficult for both of us. I spent hours researching ways to help Max, determined to be the person he needed me to be. The journey we were on was no longer just about a stray dog finding a home. It was about healing old wounds and rebuilding trust. Max had been through too much to simply push past the trauma, and I had to meet him where he was, no matter how difficult that might be. Max's behavior gradually started to change. The first step was acknowledging his fears and respecting his boundaries. No longer did I try to force him into situations he wasn't ready for. If Max wanted to stay inside and watch the world from the safety of the porch, I let him. I stopped pushing him to go on walks or engage with the world in ways he wasn't prepared for. Instead, I gave him space. I understood now that healing wasn't linear, and there would be days when he would retreat into himself, and that was okay. Patience, I realized, was the most important gift I could give him. At night, I sat beside him on the porch, the two of us sharing the quiet. I noticed that Max didn't flinch as much anymore. His trembling had subsided, though it still appeared on occasion, like a gentle reminder of what he had been through. And while the fear in his eyes had softened, it hadn't disappeared completely. But that was all right. I wasn't expecting him to change overnight, and neither was he. We were in this together, taking it one step at a time. The turning point came one afternoon when I decided to bring Max on a short walk around the block. I've been trying to build his confidence slowly, encouraging him with treats and soft words. But this time, I noticed something different. As we stepped off the porch, Max didn't hesitate. He walked beside me, his pace steady and determined. The old signs of anxiety were still there. His eyes would dart to the corners of every street, his ears flicking at every distant sound. But he was walking. It was a small victory, but for us, it was monumental. I remember the moment clearly. We had reached the end of the block, and Max suddenly stopped. He turned his head and looked back at me, his eyes soft but searching. It was as if he was asking for permission to move forward. I crouched down to his level and gently stroked his fur. "It's okay, Max," I whispered. "You're safe now. We can go at your pace." Max took a deep breath and then, without hesitation, started walking again, this time with a bit more confidence. That simple moment was the first time I saw Max as a dog not defined by his past, but as a creature capable of embracing a future with me. He was no longer a dog haunted by abandonment and betrayal. He was starting to find his place in the world, and so was I. Over the next few weeks, our connection grew stronger. We spent more time together, whether it was taking slow walks through the neighborhood, playing in the yard, or just sitting together on the porch in silence. Each moment, no matter how small, was a victory in our shared healing process. Max was learning to trust me, and I was learning to trust him too. There were moments when Max's fears would resurface. One evening, a thunderstorm rolled in unexpectedly. The sounds of heavy rain and crashing thunder triggered something deep within Max. He trembled, cowering in a corner of the house, his eyes wide and full of fear. My heart broke as I watched him, but I refused to let him face it alone. I sat with him, gently rubbing his back, speaking in soft, calming tones. The storm raged outside, but within the safety of our home, Max had found a haven. I didn't rush him or force him to calm down. Instead, I let him experience his fear, knowing that simply being there with him would show him he wasn't alone. And slowly, Max began to learn that the storms, both literal and metaphorical, no longer had the power to control him. He would still be scared sometimes, but he now knew that there was someone there to hold him, to remind him that fear didn't have to define him. It was in these quiet moments of understanding that our bond grew. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it did happen. Max grew into a more confident dog. He began to venture farther from the porch, exploring the yard with curiosity, no longer constantly scanning the horizon for danger. He made friends with the other dogs in the neighborhood, and I noticed how his playful side started to emerge. The sad, withdrawn dog I had taken in was now full of life, running, playing, and even barking with excitement when we went for walks. But beyond the external changes, it was the internal shift that I found most remarkable. Max was no longer defined by his past, no longer trapped by the trauma he had carried for so long. He was healing piece by piece, and so was I. The process of adopting Max, of helping him find peace after everything he had endured, had changed me too. I had learned to be patient, to embrace vulnerability, and to understand that love and trust are not given. They are earned slowly over time. One afternoon, as I sat in the yard, watching Max chase a ball, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. This dog, this once terrified stray who had refused to leave my porch, had become a true companion. He had taught me the power of resilience and the importance of showing up, even when it seemed like healing would take forever. The truth about Max's past had broken my heart, but it also led to a beautiful resolution, a resolution built on trust, healing, and the bond that grew between us. Max was no longer just a stray dog. He was family. As I watched him run across the yard, his tail wagging with unrestrained joy, I couldn't help but smile. He had found his home, and so had I. The journey with Max, the stray dog who had once refused to leave my porch, had been a journey like no other. When he first appeared, it was as if fate had placed him at my doorstep for a reason. The little dog with sad eyes and a history I couldn't fully comprehend became the catalyst for a life-changing experience. What started as an act of kindness, leaving food for a hungry animal, grew into something far deeper than I could have ever anticipated. At the beginning, Max was nothing more than a fragile shell of a dog, deeply scarred by his past. His trust had been broken, and every move he made seemed to be calculated to avoid further harm. He was hesitant, fearful, and deeply wary of everything around him. But over time, the bond we formed grew stronger, not just for him, but for me too. Max taught me the most important lesson of all, that love, patience, and trust are the keys to healing, both for humans and animals. The bond between us was not one of instant gratification. It was slow, steady, and filled with many ups and downs. There were days when Max would retreat, frightened by some distant sound or a memory he couldn't outrun. There were days when I felt helpless, wondering if we would ever get past the walls he had built around himself. But each small victory, each step forward, was a testament to the power of unconditional love. The days when Max finally let go of his fears, whether it was walking beside me on our daily walks or finally curling up on the couch with me, were moments I will cherish forever. These small, seemingly insignificant actions spoke volumes about the progress we were making together. Max's growth was not just physical, but emotional as well. He began to trust again. He would wag his tail when I came home, jump excitedly at the prospect of a walk, and sometimes even nudge me with his nose as if to remind me that he was there. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. He wasn't the same dog that had wandered into my life months ago. He was stronger, braver, and more willing to embrace the love and care I had to offer. But the most surprising part of this journey was the impact it had on me. In nurturing Max, I found myself healing too. His journey of overcoming fear and mistrust mirrored my own in many ways. I too had faced struggles in life, emotional battles, moments of self-doubt, and periods of uncertainty. But through Max, I learned that healing is a process, that time and patience are necessary for growth. I had to learn to be as patient with myself as I was with him. The connection we shared became a mutual experience of healing. As Max's trust grew, so did my understanding of what it truly means to be compassionate and resilient. Max's journey also led me to appreciate the beauty of second chances. We often think of second chances as something reserved for people, but animals deserve them just as much. Max was given a second chance at a better life, and in turn, he gave me a chance to be part of something truly special. We both learned to trust again, not just in each other, but in the goodness of the world. His presence in my life brought immeasurable joy, and the love we shared became the foundation for a new chapter in both our lives. Today, as I sit here, watching Max chase after a ball in the yard, I'm filled with gratitude. Grateful for the courage he showed in allowing himself to trust again. Grateful for the love that blossomed between us, despite the odds. Grateful for the reminder that sometimes the most beautiful stories come from the most unexpected places. Max is no longer the same dog who hesitated at my doorstep, unsure of what the future held. He is a happy, playful dog with a full heart and a future that shines bright. And although his past will always be a part of him, it no longer defines him. He is more than his history. He is a testament to the power of love, healing, and the bond that can form between a human and an animal. As I reflect on our journey, I know that the lessons Max taught me will stay with me for the rest of my life. It wasn't just about adopting a stray dog. It was about learning to be patient with myself and others. It was about understanding that healing doesn't happen overnight, and that it requires kindness, compassion, and trust. Max helped me rediscover these virtues and reminded me that, no matter the obstacles we face, there is always room for love to flourish. Max's story is a reminder that every animal deserves love and care, no matter their past. If you're thinking of adopting a pet, or if you have already opened your heart to an animal in need, I encourage you to be patient, be kind, and trust the process. Sometimes the love you give will come back to you in ways you could never imagine. The joy of seeing an animal who was once lost and scared blossom into a loving companion is indescribable. The rewards are more than worth the effort. So, if you're ready to change a life, consider adopting an animal who needs you. Whether it's a stray dog, a cat in need of a home, or any other animal, there is a soul out there waiting for a second chance. The bond you form will change both your lives in ways you never expected. If you found Max's story inspiring, I encourage you to share it. Let's spread the message that second chances matter, that love can heal, and that sometimes the most beautiful relationships come from the most unlikely beginnings. Together, we can make a difference in the lives of animals who need our help. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more heartwarming stories about animals and the life-changing power of love. Share this video with your friends and family, and let's keep spreading kindness and compassion one story at a time.